What is up, my bodyweight warriors, and welcome back to another video. Today I want to go over a topic that's already been covered a little bit here online, and that is the difference between flexibility and mobility. But I didn't want to just add to the conversation, repeating the same stuff. I wanted to additionally share my own personal perspective of how I classify these two things, and what I personally think is more effective and how I would set things up in a routine to develop more flexibility and mobility, whatever you want to call it. You may notice if you've been paying attention to any of my videos, if you've been using any of the follow-alongs, some of them are named flexibility routines, some of them are named mobility routines, and this does kind of derive off a definition. I've been asked on various videos, various comments, social medias, just to define the difference between flexibility and mobility. So here is the bare bones basic explanation. Mobility is basically strength through range. It's your ability to control the movement of a joint. Whereas flexibility is these muscles' ability to lengthen, often done through external force. So these definitions is just super straightforward and simple. And whilst there may be alternative definitions of this, depending on professions, if you're a physio, if you're a chiropractor, all that sort of things. So that's kind of what flexibility and mobility is. Here's my 2 cents on this whole thing. I personally don't care too much for the terms. The terms are just a definition thing. And to be honest, I feel that it's somewhat restrictive when it comes to deciding about a modality or something to go after. So yes, I do name my routines, flexibility or mobility routines, to kind of differentiate between the more active ones, the more passive ones. I think that is a useful definition, but often this has kind of become more of a buzzword, mobility WOD, for example. Everyone wants to get after mobility. I think it's kind of lost its meaning in a lot of regards. I personally like to look at flexibility training as just classed as flexibility. I personally don't care if it's something that's referred to as more active mobility or more passive flexibility. I class everything as flexibility. One nice simple term. We're trying to get more flexible, develop more range of motion. And the reason I like to classify it in this term is that, to be honest, when you're developing a good flexibility practice, it's going to need to have aspects of both mobility and flexibility. Don't believe some of the guys who will get you doing cars every single day to create healthy joints. And also equally, you don't need to stretch and sit in stretches for minutes on end every single day. You need both aspects of mobility and flexibility to create a good, well-rounded, flexible body. So you can either disagree with this or you can agree with this. I personally just think it's a simpler way to navigate this whole range of motion field. As for which one is better, I think kind of my previous statement sums things up. Both are necessary, but I actually prefer to go one step further when it comes to defining different modalities of training for flexibility, because when we're defining mobility or flexibility, it's more of a definition term. It's not necessarily a term that relates to training, which is actually how you develop flexibility or mobility. I personally prefer to refer to flexibility training under 3 main kind of broad headers. Each of these headers are going to encompass a variety of techniques. And I've kind of come to this conclusion from learning from various disciplines, people like Emmett Lewis, also from reading Thomas Kurz and some other people. And this is kind of where I personally sit on this. I'm not saying this is the best thing. I'm not saying this is correct, because there's lots of ways to skin a cat. This is how I personally like to classify things. So I like to classify my flexibility training into 3 camps. We have movement, active, and passive. 3 simple terms. When we're talking about movement flexibility, I guess you could also classify this as dynamic, but the term dynamic flexibility has other connotations, so I like to use the word movement. All this refers to is using dynamic movements to use your full range of motion. Now, this covers quite a wide variety of things. I like to think probably my first and foremost when I'm looking at training is going to be strength training for flexibility. So that might look at something like a split squat, for example, something I've covered to help develop squat mobility. Or it might be the Romanian deadlift, something that's going to be good at developing hamstring flexibility. I actually have a whole video on using strength training to develop flexibility, so I'll link that one in the description down below. That kind of covers my opinion on that. But this could also be other techniques as well. It could be using kicks, it could be using arm swings. Think of it as any kind of dynamic movement that uses your full range of motion in the focus of developing flexibility. I would class that as movement flexibility training. Next, we have active flexibility training. Now, active flexibility training is a more static position, but it specifically is about using your own strength to hold a position. This comes down to basically using the antagonist muscle, the opposite to the muscle you're trying to stretch, the agonist muscle, to hold yourself in a stretch position. Now, a super simple example of this is if we're trying to develop hamstring flexibility, we can just hold the leg out in front of us. Here we're using the hip flexor and the quad to hold the leg in that position, and that is creating a stretch on the hamstring. This is something that's relevant to, say, the L-sit. So this is active flexibility. Now this, again, will cover a variety of techniques. Another buzzword that is used is something called end range conditioning or end range strength, that sort of stuff in the flexibility world. That very much lends itself to active flexibility training. It's not quite as generic as that dynamic movement flexibility training in which we're doing actual moves with a bias on flexibility, but instead its sole purpose is about improving range of motion and specifically the closing the antagonistic side of the joint. One of the reasons that this is useful is because it uses something called reciprocal inhibition. So this is when we contract the antagonist of a muscle being stretched, the opposite muscle, going back to that hip flexor quad being used. This in turn will help relax the hamstring and give it more incentive to stretch because it thinks we're stronger in this position. This one, to be honest, is one of my personal favorites and most effective ways of developing flexibility. Finally, we come to that passive flexibility. And this, again, it covers a wide variety of techniques, but it's basically more about sitting in a stretch position. It doesn't just mean sitting passively in a stretch position. That could be the goal of some aspects, but it also is going to cover techniques such as PNF or PIR, techniques of which we use a contract relax method in this stretch position, in this more passive position, to gain more range of motion. Again, this one is also incredibly powerful, and it's going to develop more of that passive range of motion, useful if you want to get splits or if you're doing gymnastics, a whole host of other things. So which one is the best? Should you tend towards mobility training or flexibility training, or my personal split on things, the movement dynamic style, the active style, the passive style? Well, as I said beforehand, they all are relevant. The movement style of training, that dynamic method, is better at increasing, weirdly enough, dynamic flexibility, or actually flexibility you're going to use in a range of motion. But this will also impact and improve your active flexibility and your passive flexibility. And likewise, training active or passive will help dynamic. They're all going to feed in together. But one thing that is important to understand is that everything is going to be governed by the SAID principle, specific adaptation to imposed demand. Whatever you are going to do, you're going to get better at that. If you want to develop your passive range of motion more, work more on passive flexibility stretching methods. If you want to develop active flexibility, work more on active methods. If you just want to be able to use more range of motion, maybe you're going to focus on the movement, the dynamic style, but also include other aspects of passive and active. I originally set out with the intent of this video explaining how to train flexibility, but I think it's almost possibly made things more confusing. So let's wrap things up. Ultimately, I think, as I said, you need to have pretty much all aspects of this flexibility practice to get a nice, well-rounded, flexible body. Depending on the individual, depending on what you want to get out of it, you might want to have a bias to some types more than others. As I've said, I find that active flexibility, that for me, combined with the strength training, is a very, very effective way to train your stretching. And I've actually kind of gone over this in my video on how often should you stretch. And in that I talk about how to combine those hard, intense strength training style stretching methods with the more relaxed passive ones. So I'll link to that video down below, along with anything else that is relevant today. If you are looking for some specific guidance, then I always have my app, which is available in the link in the description down below. That has kind of a lot of the methods I've talked about today built into it for developing flexibility, but also strength and handstands and all sorts of other things. If you have any questions, I'm sure you probably do have some questions, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section down below. I'd love to hear from you and what you thought of this video. Please join the conversation, let me know your thoughts on this. I do read every single one. If you just enjoyed this video, you can always hit that thumbs up button and support the channel. Right next to it is that subscribe button if you don't want to miss out on any more future videos. We don't always try to make things more confusing. Usually we try to solve problems, share routines, do all that good stuff. So make sure you stick around for that. But that has basically been it for this week, guys. I'll catch you in the next episode. Have a strong week and peace.